Is it easier to be a producer or a mixer? That's the question. Now, when I say producer, I mean in the traditional sense of the word, like Rick Rubin is the greatest producer of all time, not beat maker. I'm not talking about beat maker. I'm talking about traditional sense, okay? They're totally different jobs and they require different skills. In a way, if I had to explain it on like an ethereal level, I would say that a producer is, you have to be extremely emotionally intelligent and really be a problem solver, someone who knows when they're getting the best out of an artist or not, knows when to push, knows when, really understands their own taste and has no qualms asserting themselves in a place of this needs to be done again. I don't like this. We should take this off. They really need strong opinions, okay? A mixer also needs strong opinions, but it's a different thing, okay? Now, when it comes to being a producer, that ability to read the room and communicate well, the social aspect of it is so much more important than it is if you're a mixer. If you're a mixer, most of the time you're working alone. You're working on stuff that gets sent to you. You may have meetings with artists, via FaceTime, via screen share, where you're basically sharing your DAW with them and they're giving you mix notes, or you may do things like that. But what you're also doing is working alone most of the time. It's a very lonely profession because most of the time there's not somebody over your shoulder watching you mix. And if there was, it wouldn't help anyway, because often you need to dissect something, break it apart, get into what it's really, so we can figure out what needs to change and what is this and what sound is causing this problem. It's super technical, very more scientific in a way, whereas the other way is more emotional. Being a producer is more emotional. Being a mixer is more mathematical or scientific, or, there's a problem caused by something, and then you got to figure out what that is. And that's a very, methodical process, okay? A process of elimination, all sorts of things you'll do. You might do similar things like this when you're producing to get to the, what do I like about this song and this and that, but it's more big picture, okay? And if I had to say which one's easier, the biggest thing that comes to mind about easier or not is that most of the time, the producer is the mixer's boss. The producer is the guy who will decide whether they like a mix or not, and if they don't, there's no shortage of mixers out there who can deliver a different product. Now, a guy like Rick Rubin, and he's the most notable producer there is, and he's also a guy that has a very interesting take on what he does when he has a record he's producing and he wants it mixed. It's different than a lot of other guys. Some guys will use the same mixer all the time. Some producers use the same mixer because in a way it diminishes the margin of error. It means that they know that this mixer they always use is capable of delivering a great product, and they're not really concerned about a little better one way or another, a little different sound here or there. They just want somebody who's always going to deliver something, and they trust and have faith in this guy like a Serban. So they always send him everything they do. Now, that's a very different thing than the way Rick Rubin works. Rick Rubin is known to have mixed shootouts. And on the interview he just did with Rick Beato, he confirmed this and talked about this. They went into detail a little bit, where he basically says that he's done this tons and tons of times. On records like Californication, for example, he didn't expect the album to sound the way he liked it best. He had many different mixers mix, I think 2 or 3 songs. And then the guy that mixed it the way he expected it to sound, everyone agreed sounded pretty good. But the guy who mixed it in a way he didn't expect it to sound, and the band didn't expect it to sound, was actually the guy they chose to mix the record. Now, that's because Rick Rubin's got the most experience at being a producer, so he knows some guys do better on certain projects than other guys. It's about how they hear it, how they hear the whole project. Every mixer hears differently. Every mixer is going to interpret it slightly differently. Now, if you're a guy who uses the same mixer for everything, even if it's Rubin, a guy who's arguably the top mixer in the world right now, because he mixes all sorts of genres. He's all across the gamut, from hard rock stuff to Taylor Swift and everything in between. The guy does everything. So because of that, he's, probably getting paid also more than every other mixer there is at the moment. But he's the most in-demand mixer. That's why he can charge more than everybody else. But that doesn't mean that he'll always have the best mix on any given song or any given project, like any given album. It doesn't mean that. And I think Rick Rubin, who's been around long enough to know that that's the way it works, is that different people hear different things, and some people just connect with a project in a certain way, and it makes it sound amazing. Now, if you're never willing to try out other mixers, you never get that ability to see who could offer you what in which given circumstance. But Rick Rubin knows he gets the best possible sound that way. But what I was saying before about how the producer is the mixer's boss, if the mixer mixes in a way that the producer doesn't like, all the producer and the band essentially do is, no, let's try someone else. Let's move on. All right, let's try someone else. Let's try someone else. They keep trying different people until they get what they want out of the project. Or they make tweaks, and they keep tweaking the mix and keep making changes and keep requesting different changes. They keep doing that until they get something they want out of, if they choose the mixer and they do that. Either way, the mixer is subservient to the producer. The mixer has to listen to what the producer is saying and make those changes, or he risks them using another mixer to do this project. So by no way, shape, or form is the mixer just allowed to do what he wants, hear it the way he hears it. He thinks it's the best. He sends it off, and then he's done. They have to like it. So because of that, in my opinion, it's an easier job to be a producer than a mixer, because the producer is going to be the boss of deciding what is good, what is bad. Do we use another mixer? Is that mixer get fired? He's the top guy in that totem pole. The artist and the producer work together to come up with what the answers to these questions are. But ultimately, the producer is the one in charge of this stuff over the mixer. So because of that, the mixer's job is one where you do your best, you be as creative as you can, you come up with something you love, and then if the producer doesn't like it, tough noogies. It just happens to be. Now you got to change what you thought was great and make it what you think is less great. Or maybe you'll like it better after you make these changes, but maybe not. Okay, so the point is, it's not up to you. You then become a subservient hand to make the project whatever it has to be. So, and the other thing is this, as a producer, you're making decisions on what you like and don't like so that things get recorded the way you want. But then ultimately, you could, if you wanted to, try out 20 different people, 100. I mean, depending on what kind of budget the label has or whatever this is for, you could try out 100 different people mixing your song and figure out which one you like the best. You could. I mean, it's something you could possibly, if you wanted to, you could do it. You could try 10, 5, 100, right? Doesn't matter. No matter what, in all those circumstances, if they don't like the way it sounds, they're going to blame the mixer. They're not going to blame the producer. The producer I'm talking about and the band is not going to blame the producer. They're going to blame the mixer. And then they're just going to use another mixer. So in a way, the producer's job is one in which they do all this creative work, and then they get to maintain that decision of what is going to be kept and go on the record or not. So if you look at it that way, it's easier to be in that position. You get to do all the great creative stuff and all the great decision-making stuff, and then you also get to control what the final product is, and your job is never at risk in that way. So that's an interesting thing. Granted, if the band doesn't like the project, the whole product at the end, they may not hire that producer again. But until that decision is made at some point, They go down the whole path and they try different mixers, and the producer's the last one to go. You know what I'm saying? So it's a very interesting thing. When you're a mixer, you're a hired hand. And when you're a producer, you're part of the band. That's a big difference. You know, on that album, you're a part of the band. So I think this is important stuff to note. It's critical, whether it could be that album or that song. Either way, you're a part of the decision makers when you're a producer. And if you're a mixer, you're not. And as a result, the mixing job is harder, because no matter what you do and what you come up with, it's never up to you. Whereas as a producer, it is. It's up to you whether you decide that this doesn't work. And then you got to be creative, and you got to be socially adept. You know, you got to be socially capable to be able to come up with a way to explain that to the band and get them to do it again in a way that you might like it. Big differences between the two. Another huge difference is a producer is married to the record in a way, because they're always going to get a percentage of what happens with that. A mixer, on the other hand, is going to get paid, and maybe a point, maybe some small, very small percentage, way smaller than the producer. So, you know, but also you could say that the mixer's not involved with the whole project and the producer is, and it could take a long, long, long time. It could take a year to record it, whatever. Yeah, that's true. And maybe as a result, the producer's entitled to more. But I'm just saying, at the end of it all, the producer has way more control than the mixer does. But the mixer has way more of a control of how the final product sounds than a lot of people want to think about. That's why it's never enough for me to know who produced something. I want to know who mixed it. Produced, great, but who mixed it? Because I know how important that is. Anybody who's ever produced their own stuff knows that if you mix it yourself, it sounds one way. And then if you give it to someone else to mix and it sounds way better, that's all in the mix. Now, who can make it sound better? Like, there's so much control that the mixer has, which is why Rick Rubin doesn't send it to the same guy every time. Don't you think the best producer in the world would just always send it to the best mixer in the world if there was such a thing? There isn't. No matter how great Serban is, and I do think Serban is great, believe me, I think there's a logic to Rick Rubin's way of thinking, which is somebody is going to do this better than somebody else because of all these intangible elements in the sky and in that mixer's head and in that thought process that goes on in that mixer's head in that moment in time. That's going to change so many things. Somebody could be better at mixing this song than someone else. Now, he leaves that door open and tries different mixers. And this should give you also like a little bit of hope. If you're a mixer who's unknown, this should give you some hope, because in a way, the way Rick Rubin works leaves the door open for him to hear something he likes that you've done and then put you in on the mix shootout. And then your mix is going to go up against other people's, and whoever is the best wins. They don't look at who does what until they pick the version. In other words, he's smart enough to know blind test is everything, so he doesn't want to know. Rick Rubin doesn't want to know whose is whose. He just listens, picks the one he likes, then looks at who did it. So the point is, everyone's on an even playing field at that level. And that's pretty huge. So that should give you a little bit of hope. Also, the concept that the best producer in the world knows that he can't always send it to one person because the results wouldn't be as good should be a thing that you all take a little bit of, pride in, the fact that that's obviously the case. No matter how good Serban is, it's going to be somebody else's day on something, and Rick Rubin's smart enough to know that. So in my opinion, there's not a right way or a wrong way. This is just my opinion about this. But in my opinion, doing the job of mixing is very much akin to dressing up somebody. Let's say you got a movie star, you got Brad Pitt. You could dress him up in tons of different stuff. He's always going to be Brad Pitt underneath, and that's the artist. He's Brad Pitt. But if you dress him up one way, he's got one, he looks a certain way. He's got one sort of style. And if it's a bad mix, maybe you dress him up in a way that's all out of whack, you know, and it makes him look really heavy and lopsided. And he loses his shape completely. He doesn't look like Brad Pitt anymore. You know, he looks like some fat version of Brad Pitt. That would be a bad mix. You see what I'm saying? But the point is, how you dress him up is really like how he is styled is the mix. In a way, that's how I look at it. It's like he comes to the table as Brad Pitt. That's the artist with the producer's production. And then how is he dressed up? Because if you push too much on the low end, okay, now he's fat. Okay, you push too much on the high end, now his head's too big. You understand what I'm saying? He's going to morph and change the look of what he's wearing, and his whole thing is going to change and morph based on what's going on in the mix. So in a way, it's like mixing is like the designing of the outfit, the clothes of this person. That's what, and the person is the song. And that's what the mix is. All right. So in my opinion, that's the mix. Whereas a producer, a really good producer, doesn't put their own sound, the producer's own sound, into that song. Rick Rubin talked about this, and I think every great producer knows this, that if you make an artist sound like you being the producer, if you make an artist sound like you, that's a bad thing. You want the artist to sound like them. As a producer, you want to be the lens that magnifies what this artist is and how great they are at whatever they're great at. Whatever their specialty is, that's what being a producer is. It's bringing that out like a lens that focuses on the important parts and gets what you want to be seen. That's the producer. It's the lens. Whereas the mixer is not. The mixer is who dresses this thing up and decides what this thing should wear. And they're both critically important. So important. Because a product will sound so different depending on who mixes it. And this wasn't the case years ago when everything was done to tape and everybody had mostly the same equipment. In other words, most studios, you know, like originally studios would have certain gear. That's why people would go to them, and they all had different gear. But when guys like Neve came around and they started making stuff for everyone, studios wound up all buying similar sounds. And then they all had the same kind of sound in the studio. But there also wasn't a ton of tools to be creative with outside of that. There were tools, but there weren't as many as there are now. So now, because there's so many tools, I feel like that's the reason every mixer has their own unique sound, even more so than years ago. Because mixers can use any tools, and there's so many, and any combination of those tools, and lean harder on some rather than others. Certain reverbs they prefer, certain, you know, delays they prefer than others, certain compressors. All these things sort of have a sound. And no matter if it's plug-in form or hardware, it doesn't matter. Whichever sounds they're picking to make the mix, because there's such a variety of them and so many of them out there, it's like the sound is going to be whatever they choose to use more often than not. Because no matter what, no mixer starts from scratch every time. They all have things they like, things they're comfortable with, things they're familiar with, tools like they use more than other tools. Because of that, the mixes sound the way those tools sound used in that way. It's a lot about the way the mixer hears. That's why Serban can never make a mix like a BrendanO'Brien mix. Serban cannot deliver a BrendanO'Brien mix. He can't do it because he's Serban. He hears the way he hears, and when people hire Serban, they're hiring him for the way he hears and his specific style that he imparts into the mix. Just like BrendanO'Brien can't deliver a Serban mix. They're both amazing mixers, and if anything, in my opinion, that's why I value BrendanO'Brien as much as I do, because not only is he a great mixer and mixed so many of the records that I love, he also produced them. So this is somebody who, when you think about what's harder, producing or mixing, he had to do both. And he didn't even have to do it. He wanted to do both because he was great at both, and that allowed him the most control. Because like I told you, as soon as you send it to a mixer, now it's going to sound largely like the way that mixer mixes, the way that mixer hears. It's no longer just about how the producer heard and made all the decisions to make it what it was. It's now about the mixer also, how they hear. And that bit of compromise, I don't think Brendan O'Brien ever really liked that, which is why when he did, I forget which record he did, I think it was a Rage Against the Machine record, I believe, but he didn't mix it. Andy Wallace did, and he was upset about it. So it's one of those things. It was either Rage or Audio Slave, but I'm pretty sure it was Rage. He produced it, didn't mix it. Brendan O'Brien produced it, didn't mix it. Andy Wallace mixed it, and he was very upset that he didn't get to mix it. But it was basically he didn't have the time. He had other things scheduled, and there was a deadline on that. So, things happen. But the point is, that's somebody who had control over the entire production, and then he was also an amazing mixer. And I've mixed a lot of stuff. I know how tedious it can be, how hard it can be, because sometimes you're just never satisfied, and things are just never, you wish it could be different, or you're just always trying to get it a little better, get it a little better, get it a little better. So I really value somebody like that who was able to do both at that level that he was able to do both. That's what I think. It goes over so many people's heads, because not a lot of people do that. There's not a lot of people who are able to achieve the level of success that he achieved. And he's a great musician, and he's a great mixer, and he's a great producer. It's out of control. And I don't think enough people really understand how hard it is to do all those things at that level. It's pretty amazing. So anyway, I don't want to go too deep, too hard into it, but the point is, I really believe that some people are better suited to one or the other, and it's extremely rare to get somebody who's great at both, producing and mixing. But I'm curious what you guys think. Throw something in the comments. I really, really appreciate it. Hit the subscribe button. I really appreciate that, all right? Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.